Before Christmas became a celebration, it was a story shaped by winter, belief, and hope. From ancient solstice traditions, to the birth of Jesus Christ, and the centuries that followed, this is the true history of Christmas. Winter before Christmas. Long before Christmas had a name, winter itself shaped the rhythm of human life. Across ancient landscapes, winter was not a season of celebration. It was a test. Cold dark days stretched endlessly, harvests had ended, and survival depended on preparation made months earlier. Communities gathered closer, not out of joy, but necessity. Fires became sacred without words. Light meant life. Darkness meant uncertainty. In these early societies, people did not measure time with calendars. They measured it by the sun's path, by the shortening of days, by the moment when the sun seemed to hesitate in the sky. Winter was not feared alone. It was respected. This deep awareness of winter laid the foundation for everything that would later become Christmas. Not as a holiday, but as a response to darkness. Before theology. Before tradition. Before celebration. There was winter, and the human need to endure it together. The longest night. As the days grew shorter, ancient people noticed something unsettling. Each sunrise arrived later. Each sunset came sooner. The darkness expanded slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it dominated the day. This was not poetry, it was survival knowledge. The longest night of the year approached. Without scientific explanation, people felt the danger instinctively. What if the sun did not return? What if the light continued to fade? This fear was shared across continents, cultures, and centuries. And yet, within that fear, something else appeared: anticipation. The winter solstice marked a turning point. A moment when the darkness stopped growing. A moment when light, slowly and quietly, began to return. This was not a celebration yet. It was recognition. The world had not ended. The night had reached its limit. Light as hope. When light finally returned, it was not greeted with noise. It was greeted with relief. Across ancient cultures, the return of longer days carried meaning far beyond weather. Light became a symbol, not yet religious, but deeply human. It meant survival. It meant continuity. It meant that life, however fragile, would continue. Small rituals began to form. Fires were kept burning longer. Evergreen branches were brought indoors as reminders that life endured even in cold. Communities gathered, not to celebrate excess, but to reassure one another. This relationship between darkness and light would echo through centuries. When Christmas eventually emerged, it did not replace this meaning. It absorbed it. Light would remain at the center of the story. As winter settled deeper into the ancient world, human societies began to respond not only with preparation, but with meaning. Long nights and shortened days created a psychological weight that demanded more than food and fire. People needed structure. They needed reassurance that darkness had purpose, that cold had an end. This need gave rise to winter festivals, long before Christmas existed. Across civilizations, these festivals were not identical, yet they shared a common foundation. They marked the same moment in time, the turning of the year, when the sun reached its lowest point and began its slow return. The details varied, but the intention remained constant: to acknowledge survival, continuity, and renewal. In ancient Rome, winter brought Saturnalia, a festival honoring Saturn, the god of agriculture and time. Unlike later formal religious observances, Saturnalia temporarily dissolved social boundaries. Work slowed. Normal hierarchies softened. Public life became more relaxed. It was not chaos, but release. Saturnalia reminded people that order itself depended on balance. Excessive rigidity was as dangerous as disorder. For a brief time, society allowed itself to breathe. Elsewhere in Europe, particularly in northern regions, winter festivals took a different shape. Among Germanic and Norse cultures, the season was marked by Yule. This was not merely a celebration, but a survival marker. Fires burned continuously. Animals were slaughtered before feed ran out. Feasts were practical as much as symbolic. Evergreen plants, trees, branches, wreaths, played an important role. They represented endurance. While most of the natural world appeared lifeless, evergreens remained green. They became symbols of continuity and resilience rather than decoration. These festivals did not deny winter's harshness. They acknowledged it openly. People understood that winter was dangerous. Disease spread more easily. Hunger threatened constantly. Darkness weighed heavily on the human mind. Festivals existed not to escape these realities, but to confront them collectively. Light became the central symbol across cultures. Fires, candles, torches, all were used deliberately. Light pushed back darkness not physically, but emotionally. It created spaces where people could gather, speak, and feel secure. Importantly, these festivals were not expressions of blind optimism. They were grounded in experience. Communities had survived winter before. The festivals reaffirmed that survival was possible again. As centuries passed, these winter observances became embedded in cultural memory. They were not written down initially. They were repeated. Passed through generations by practice rather than doctrine. When new belief systems emerged, particularly Christianity, these older traditions did not simply disappear. They existed in the cultural environment into which Christianity spread. This is a crucial historical point. Christianity did not emerge in isolation. It developed within societies that already understood winter symbolically. People were already accustomed to marking this time of year with meaning, reflection, and hope. When the story of Jesus Christ began to spread across the Roman Empire, it encountered these established seasonal frameworks. The message of light entering darkness, of hope born in hardship, resonated deeply, not because it replaced older meanings, but because it aligned with them. Early Christians did not immediately celebrate the birth of Jesus. For generations, the focus remained on his teachings, crucifixion, and resurrection. Birthdays were not central to early Christian practice. Yet as Christianity grew and became institutionalized, it faced a practical reality: people already gathered during winter. They already understood this season as meaningful. They already expected something to mark the turning of the year. The question was not whether winter would be significant. It was how that significance would be expressed. The eventual emergence of Christmas did not erase ancient winter festivals. It absorbed their structure while reshaping their meaning. Light remained central. Gathering remained essential. Hope remained the underlying message. What changed was the story being told. Where once the sun's return symbolized survival, Christianity offered a theological interpretation: the birth of Christ as the arrival of divine light into the world. This transition was gradual. It unfolded over centuries, not overnight. Old customs persisted alongside new beliefs. People adapted slowly, blending practices rather than abandoning them. Understanding this process is essential to understanding Christmas itself. Christmas did not begin as a single moment or decision. It emerged through layers of history, through winter, tradition, belief, and time. And before it became a celebration known across the world, it existed as a quiet continuation of humanity's oldest response to darkness. Gather together. Protect the light. Endure the night. The birth of Christianity and the question of time. As Christianity began to spread across the Roman world, it entered a society already shaped by centuries of tradition, seasonal rhythm, and deeply rooted cultural habits. This context is essential to understanding how Christmas would later emerge, not suddenly, and not in isolation, but through a long process of interaction between belief and lived experience. In its earliest form, Christianity was not concerned with marking time through festivals. The first Christian communities were small, often persecuted, and focused primarily on teaching, moral conduct, and the memory of Jesus Christ's life, death, and resurrection. These events, especially the resurrection, formed the theological center of early Christian faith. The birth of Jesus, while deeply meaningful, was not immediately celebrated as a recurring event. In fact, the Gospels themselves do not provide a specific date for Jesus' birth. They offer narratives, accounts of place, people, and circumstances, but not a calendar reference. This absence was not an oversight. In the ancient world, birthdays were not universally celebrated, and among early Christians, the idea of commemorating a birth was not considered spiritually essential. What mattered was not when Jesus was born, but what his life represented. As Christianity expanded beyond its earliest communities and began to attract followers across different regions, it encountered an important challenge: time. How should sacred history be remembered? How should belief be structured across the year? This question became more pressing as Christianity moved from the margins of society toward its center. By the 3rd century, Christian thinkers and leaders were increasingly concerned with establishing order, coherence, and shared practice among growing communities. This included developing calendars that reflected theological priorities. At the same time, these communities lived within societies that already observed seasonal milestones. Winter, in particular, remained a powerful period, marked by long nights, reduced labor, and established customs. Even as Christianity introduced new beliefs, it could not erase the physical and social realities of the seasons. Instead, it adapted. The idea of associating Jesus' birth with a meaningful moment in the year emerged gradually. Early Christian scholars debated not only when Jesus might have been born, but whether the birth should be commemorated at all. Some argued that emphasizing the incarnation, the moment when God entered human history, held profound theological significance. Others remained cautious, wary of adopting practices that might resemble pagan celebrations. This tension did not produce immediate answers. It produced discussion. In different parts of the Christian world, different dates were proposed. Some communities associated Jesus' birth with spring. Others linked it to January. There was no universal agreement. What unified these debates was a shared intention, to honor the meaning of Christ's life in a way that aligned with Christian theology, without undermining its distinctiveness. Over time, another idea gained influence, one rooted not in festival tradition, but in symbolic theology. Early Christian thinkers developed the concept that great events in sacred history were connected. According to this view, the date of Jesus' conception was linked to the date of his death. If Jesus was believed to have been conceived on the same calendar day that he would later be crucified, then his birth would naturally fall 9 months later. This theological reasoning did not rely on historical records. It relied on symbolic harmony. In the Western Christian tradition, the date associated with the crucifixion was March 25. Counting forward 9 months placed the birth of Jesus on December 25. This idea did not immediately establish Christmas as a widespread celebration. But it provided a framework, a way to anchor the birth of Christ within a meaningful theological timeline. Importantly, this reasoning developed independently of popular festivals. It emerged from Christian attempts to understand sacred time, not from an effort to replace or mimic existing celebrations. Yet the coincidence was undeniable. December 25 already carried significance within the Roman world. It fell near the winter solstice, a time long associated with renewal and light. While Christian leaders did not simply adopt pagan meaning, they recognized that the symbolism of light entering darkness resonated deeply with the message of Christ. Gradually, this alignment became accepted. By the 4th century, as Christianity gained official recognition within the Roman Empire, the observance of Christ's birth on December 25 became more common in the West. In the East, January 6 remained significant, associated with the Epiphany, the manifestation of Christ to the world. Rather than a single origin, Christmas emerged through convergence, theology, symbolism, and lived human experience meeting at a moment in time. This process was slow, deliberate, and shaped by debate rather than decree. Christmas, as it would later be known, was not invented. It was formed. December 25 and the Roman world. By the 4th century, Christianity was no longer a small, persecuted movement existing on the edges of Roman society. It had begun to take an increasingly visible role within the empire, and with this new position came new responsibilities. Among them was the need to establish a shared religious calendar that could unify believers across vast and diverse regions. The question of Christ's birth date became part of this broader effort. December 25, already discussed within theological circles, gradually gained prominence in the Western Christian world. This was not the result of a single decision or declaration, but rather a process shaped by symbolism, tradition, and the realities of Roman life. In the Roman Empire, late December was already a meaningful period. It followed the winter solstice, the moment when the days stopped growing shorter and light slowly began to return. Even without scientific explanation, Romans understood this shift intuitively. The darkest part of the year had passed. One of the most important Roman observances during this time was the celebration of Sol Invictus, the Unconquered Sunday. Instituted officially in the 3rd century, this festival honored the sun as a symbol of stability, power, and renewal. While not universally celebrated across all Roman regions, it reflected a broader cultural emphasis on light overcoming darkness. Early Christian leaders were aware of this context. However, it is important to understand that the adoption of December 25 was not a simple attempt to replace pagan worship. Christian theology already emphasized Christ as a spiritual light entering a darkened world. The symbolism aligned naturally, without requiring imitation. As Christianity became more organized, aligning sacred events with meaningful points in the calendar helped believers understand theology through time itself. December 25 offered a powerful narrative framework, the birth of Christ at the moment when light begins to return to the world. This symbolism resonated deeply, particularly in a society accustomed to reading meaning in natural cycles. By the mid-4th century, evidence shows that December 25 was being observed as the Feast of the Nativity in Rome. From there, the practice spread gradually to other Western Christian communities. The celebration remained primarily religious in nature, focused on worship, reflection, and communal prayer rather than festivity. At the same time, Eastern Christian traditions continued to emphasize January 6th, a date associated with the Epiphany, the revelation of Christ to humanity. Rather than contradiction, this reflected regional variation within a growing global faith. What mattered most was not uniformity, but meaning. December 25th did not erase earlier traditions overnight, nor did it immediately become what modern audiences recognize as Christmas. Instead, it marked a theological anchor point, a way to place the story of Christ's birth within the flow of the year. The foundation of Christmas was now set. What remained was for centuries of culture, practice, and tradition to shape it into the celebration known today. Christmas in the early church, worship, not celebration. In its earliest centuries, Christmas was not a celebration in the modern sense of the word. For the early Christian church, the birth of Jesus Christ was understood primarily through theology rather than festivity. The focus remained on worship, reflection, and doctrine, not on outward celebration or social customs. Early Christian gatherings during the Nativity were quiet and reverent. They centered on prayer, scripture reading, and communal worship. There were no decorations, no public festivities, and no emphasis on joy as spectacle. The purpose of these gatherings was spiritual understanding rather than emotional expression. This approach reflected the broader character of early Christianity. The faith emerged in a world where public religious festivals were often elaborate and politically charged. Early Christians deliberately distinguished themselves from such displays. Their worship emphasized humility, inward devotion, and moral discipline. The Nativity, when observed, was treated as a sacred mystery rather than a holiday. The Incarnation, the belief that God had entered human history through Christ, was considered a profound theological truth. It invited contemplation, not celebration. Church leaders often warned against excess, particularly during sacred observances. Fasting, prayer, and simplicity were encouraged. This was especially true during winter, a season already associated with restraint and endurance. Over time, liturgical practices developed to mark the Nativity more clearly. Special prayers were composed. Biblical passages describing the birth of Jesus were read aloud. Hymns began to appear, though they were solemn rather than joyful. The atmosphere remained introspective. Importantly, Christmas did not yet exist as a widely shared cultural event. Many Christian communities did not observe it at all, choosing instead to focus on Easter, which commemorated the resurrection of Christ and held central theological importance. This hierarchy of sacred events shaped Christian life for centuries. Birth marked the beginning of Christ's earthly life, but resurrection marked its meaning. As Christianity spread and gained followers from different cultural backgrounds, expectations slowly changed. Converts brought with them habits shaped by earlier traditions, seasonal gatherings, communal meals, and symbolic rituals tied to winter. The Church did not immediately resist these influences. Instead, it responded cautiously, allowing certain cultural expressions to exist alongside formal worship, as long as they did not contradict Christian teaching. This gradual accommodation did not weaken the faith. It strengthened it. By allowing Christmas to remain primarily a religious observance in its early stages, the Church ensured that its theological core remained intact. Celebration would come later. Meaning came first. In these centuries, Christmas was not about joy in abundance. It was about reverence in scarcity. It was about acknowledging the Incarnation during the darkest time of the year, when light was limited and life felt fragile. The Nativity spoke quietly into that darkness. And in doing so, it prepared the way for traditions that would emerge much later, traditions built not on spectacle, but on centuries of belief, practice and reflection. The Nativity story in the Gospels. The story of Jesus Christ's birth, known as the Nativity, is preserved in the Christian tradition primarily through the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. These accounts do not function as historical records in the modern sense. Instead, they are theological narratives, shaped to convey meaning rather than chronology. This distinction is essential. The Gospels were written decades after the events they describe, within communities seeking to understand who Jesus was and why his life mattered. As a result, the Nativity stories emphasize symbolism, fulfillment of prophecy, and spiritual significance rather than precise historical detail. The Gospel of Matthew presents the birth of Jesus through the lens of fulfillment. It highlights the lineage of Jesus, tracing his ancestry to King David, and situates his birth within the broader story of Israel. In this account, Joseph plays a central role, receiving guidance through dreams and acting with obedience and restraint. Matthew's narrative introduces key symbolic elements: the star, the Magi, and the threat posed by King Herod. These details frame Jesus' birth as an event of cosmic and political importance, suggesting that his arrival disrupts existing structures of power. The Gospel of Luke, by contrast, offers a quieter and more intimate portrayal. Luke's account centers on Mary and emphasizes humility and simplicity. The setting is modest. The birth takes place away from centers of power, witnessed first not by rulers or scholars, but by shepherds. This choice is deliberate. Shepherds occupied a low position in ancient society. By presenting them as the first witnesses, Luke communicates a theological message: the significance of Jesus' birth extends to all people, especially the marginalized. Luke's narrative also includes elements that have become central to the Christian imagination: the manger, the angelic announcement, and the proclamation of peace. These details emphasize gentleness rather than spectacle, quiet revelation rather than public display. Notably, neither gospel provides a specific date for Jesus' birth. This absence reinforces the idea that the timing itself was less important than the meaning of the event. The Nativity was remembered not as a calendar moment, but as a turning point in sacred history. Over time, artistic and cultural traditions expanded upon these gospel accounts. Elements from Matthew and Luke were combined. Additional details were imagined. The nativity scene, as commonly depicted today, emerged gradually through centuries of interpretation. Yet at its core, the gospel narratives remain restrained. They describe a birth marked by humility, uncertainty, and faith. There is no celebration in the modern sense. There is no emphasis on joy as abundance. Instead, the focus rests on obedience, trust, and divine purpose unfolding quietly within human circumstances. For early Christians, these stories offered reassurance. In a world shaped by empire, hierarchy, and power, the Nativity suggested that transformation could begin in unexpected places, through ordinary people. This understanding shaped how Christmas would be remembered for generations, not as an interruption of history, but as its quiet redirection. Bethlehem, the star, and the world around the birth. The Nativity story does not unfold in isolation. It is set within a specific historical and geographical context, one shaped by political power, cultural tension, and everyday hardship. Bethlehem, the town most closely associated with the birth of Jesus, was not a center of influence. It was small, rural, and largely overlooked. Its significance lay not in its size, but in its symbolism. Bethlehem carried deep meaning within Jewish tradition as the city of King David. By situating Jesus' birth there, the gospel narratives connected him to a long line of expectation and promise. This was not accidental. It framed the Nativity within a broader historical story that listeners of the time would have recognized. The world surrounding Bethlehem was under Roman rule. The empire maintained order through administration, taxation, and military presence. Daily life for ordinary people was shaped by these structures. Travel was difficult. Resources were limited. Stability depended on obedience to authority. Within this context, the birth of a child in modest circumstances carried a powerful contrast. The Nativity narrative does not describe public announcement or political recognition. Instead, it unfolds quietly, on the margins of power. One of the most enduring symbols associated with the birth of Jesus is the star. Mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, the star guides the Magi toward Bethlehem. Over centuries, this detail has inspired theological reflection, artistic representation, and scientific speculation. Historically, scholars have debated the nature of this star. Some suggest it may have been a planetary conjunction or an astronomical event visible at the time. Others emphasize its symbolic function rather than its physical explanation. Within the Gospel narrative, the star serves as a sign, a marker that draws attention beyond local boundaries. It signals that the birth holds significance not only for one people, but for the wider world. The Magi themselves represent this broader reach. They are portrayed as outsiders, learned figures from distant lands, attentive to signs and willing to travel in search of meaning. Their presence in the Nativity story underscores the universal dimension of the event. At the same time, the narrative contrasts this openness with fear and resistance. King Herod, informed of the birth, responds not with curiosity or reverence, but with anxiety. His reaction reflects the tension between power and vulnerability, authority and uncertainty. These elements, the star, the Magi, the ruler's fear, frame the Nativity within a complex world. It is not presented as an escape from reality, but as an event unfolding within it. For early Christians, this context mattered deeply. It suggested that sacred events could occur amid political control, social inequality, and uncertainty. Meaning was not reserved for times of peace or prosperity. Bethlehem, the star, and the figures who surround the birth serve as reminders that Christmas, at its core, is a story rooted in history. It emerges from a specific place, at a particular moment, within a world shaped by human struggle. This grounding would later allow Christmas to resonate across cultures and centuries, not as myth detached from reality, but as a narrative that speaks quietly into it. Early Christian communities and the memory of the Nativity. In the decades following the life of Jesus Christ, the earliest Christian communities faced a fundamental challenge: how to preserve memory. These communities were small, dispersed, and often operating under social or political pressure. Written texts were rare. Oral tradition played a central role in shaping belief and identity. The Nativity, like many aspects of Jesus' life, was remembered through storytelling rather than formal commemoration. Early Christians gathered in homes, shared meals, and listened to accounts passed down from those who had known Jesus or learned from his first followers. These stories were not recited as historical chronicles. They were shared as sources of meaning, guidance, and reassurance. The birth of Jesus was remembered not as an isolated event, but as part of a larger narrative, one that included his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. Within this framework, the Nativity symbolized the beginning of a life that would later reshape faith and understanding. As Christianity spread beyond its earliest Jewish roots into the wider Greco-Roman world, these memories encountered new audiences. Converts from different cultural backgrounds brought different expectations about sacred history, ritual, and time. Some were accustomed to marking important events annually. Others valued philosophical reflection over seasonal observance. This diversity shaped how the Nativity was remembered. In some communities, the birth of Jesus was associated with baptism and revelation rather than a specific calendar date. January 6th, later known as Epiphany, became significant in several Eastern Christian traditions. This date emphasized manifestation, the moment when Christ was revealed to the world, rather than the details of his birth. In these contexts, the Nativity was not separated from other key moments in Jesus' life. Birth, baptism, and revelation were understood as interconnected expressions of divine presence. This approach reflects the theological priorities of early Christianity. The focus remained on meaning rather than measurement. Time was sacred insofar as it revealed purpose, not because it could be precisely recorded. Gradually, however, as Christian communities grew larger and more organized, the need for shared observances increased. Memory alone was no longer sufficient. Structure was required to unite believers across distance and difference. This shift did not erase earlier traditions. It layered new practices on top of them. The Nativity began to acquire a place within the Christian year, not as a universal celebration, but as a moment recognized differently across regions. Some communities observed it quietly. Others combined it with existing observances. Many did not mark it at all. What united these variations was a shared respect for the story itself. The birth of Jesus was not treated lightly. It was approached with reverence, restraint, and theological care. This cautious development ensured that when Christmas eventually emerged as a widely recognized celebration, it rested on centuries of reflection rather than sudden invention. The memory of the Nativity endured not because it was loudly proclaimed, but because it was carefully held. And in this quiet preservation, the foundation of Christmas continued to take shape, slowly, deliberately, and deeply rooted in belief. Epiphany, January 6th, and the Eastern Christian tradition. While December 25th gradually gained recognition in the Western Christian world, a different tradition developed in the East, one that placed emphasis not on the date of Jesus' birth alone, but on the broader revelation of his identity. This tradition centered on January 6th, a day that would later be known as Epiphany. In early Eastern Christianity, Epiphany carried layered meaning. It commemorated several interconnected events: the birth of Jesus, his baptism in the Jordan River, and the moment when his divine nature was revealed to the world. Rather than isolating one event, Epiphany presented a unified theological vision. This approach reflected the priorities of Eastern Christian thought. The focus was not on chronology, but on manifestation, on how and when divine presence became visible within human history. In this context, the Nativity was not celebrated separately. It was understood as part of a larger unfolding story. Birth, baptism, and revelation formed a continuous sequence rather than distinct commemorations. Eastern Christian communities observed Epiphany with solemnity and reverence. Worship services emphasized scripture, prayer, and theological reflection. The atmosphere was contemplative rather than festive. There were no elaborate public celebrations, no emphasis on decoration or excess. Water played a central symbolic role in Epiphany observances. The baptism of Jesus highlighted themes of purification, renewal, and transformation. Blessings of water became common practices, reinforcing the idea that divine presence entered the physical world through ordinary elements. This emphasis distinguished Epiphany from Western Nativity observances. While December 25th increasingly highlighted light and incarnation, January 6th emphasized revelation and recognition. The coexistence of these traditions illustrates an important truth about early Christianity: it was not uniform. Regional differences shaped how belief was practiced and expressed. Geography, language, and cultural background influenced theological emphasis. Rather than causing division, these variations enriched Christian tradition. They allowed different communities to articulate shared beliefs in ways that resonated locally. Over time, as communication between Eastern and Western churches increased, distinctions became clearer. December 25th and January 6th were recognized as separate observances, each carrying its own theological meaning. In some regions, both dates were honored, marking different aspects of Christ's life. This dual observance underscores the complexity of Christmas history. There was no single origin, no universal starting point. Instead, Christmas emerged through dialogue between regions, traditions, and interpretations. Understanding Epiphany helps clarify why Christmas cannot be reduced to a single date or practice. It reveals a tradition shaped by thoughtfulness rather than convenience, by theology rather than spectacle. Even today, Epiphany remains significant in many Christian communities around the world. Its continued observance reflects an ancient understanding that the story of Christ's coming cannot be contained within one moment alone. It unfolds over time. The gradual separation of Christmas and Epiphany. As Christianity continued to expand and mature, its calendar slowly became more structured. What had once been fluid, regional, and adaptable began to take clearer form. Within this process, the relationship between Christmas and Epiphany underwent an important transformation. In the earliest centuries, as seen in Eastern traditions, multiple events in the life of Jesus were often commemorated together. Birth, baptism, and revelation were viewed as inseparable expressions of divine presence. Over time, however, theological reflection and liturgical practice encouraged greater distinction between these moments. This shift was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, shaped by conversation between churches, the influence of religious leaders, and the practical needs of growing communities. In the Western Church, December 25th increasingly became associated specifically with the Nativity, the birth of Jesus. This allowed January 6th to develop a distinct identity focused on Epiphany, understood as the manifestation of Christ to the world, symbolized most clearly by the visit of the Magi. Separating these observances created space for deeper reflection. Each event could now be contemplated on its own terms. The Nativity emphasized incarnation, God entering human history in vulnerability and humility. Epiphany emphasized recognition, humanity perceiving and responding to that divine presence. This distinction also shaped how these days were observed. Christmas became more closely tied to themes of light, birth, and hope. Epiphany retained a tone of revelation, journey, and understanding. Importantly, this separation did not diminish the significance of either observance. Instead, it enriched both. By allowing each to develop its own liturgical identity, the Church expanded the narrative of Christ's coming across time rather than confining it to a single moment. The process reflected a broader pattern within Christian history. As beliefs became more defined, practices followed. What began as shared memory gradually became structured ritual. Yet even as distinctions formed, traces of earlier unity remained. In some regions, Christmas and Epiphany continued to be linked through extended periods of observance rather than isolated days. The story unfolded slowly, over weeks rather than hours. This approach aligned naturally with winter itself, a season that progresses gradually, marked by patience rather than sudden change. By the early Middle Ages, the separation between Christmas and Epiphany was firmly established across much of the Christian world. Liturgical calendars reflected this clarity. Sermons, hymns, and prayers addressed each observance with specific focus. At the same time, popular customs began to emerge alongside formal worship. These customs varied widely by region, shaped by local culture, climate, and tradition. Some reflected earlier winter practices. Others developed organically within Christian communities. The separation of Christmas and Epiphany allowed this diversity to flourish without undermining theological coherence. It provided a framework within which local expression could exist. Understanding this development helps explain why Christmas is not a single event, but part of a broader season. It also clarifies why different Christian traditions continue to observe these days in distinct ways. Christmas, as it evolved, became more than a date. It became a beginning, a point from which a larger sacred story unfolds. And that unfolding would continue for centuries to come. Christmas becomes a season, not a single day. As Christian tradition continued to develop, Christmas gradually transformed from a single observance into an extended season. This evolution reflected both theological reflection and practical experience. The story of Christ's coming was too rich, too layered, to be confined to one day alone. By the early Middle Ages, the period surrounding December 25th began to carry increasing significance. Rather than marking only the moment of birth, the Church recognized that the Nativity set in motion a sequence of meaning, one that unfolded over time through reflection, worship, and remembrance. This shift aligned naturally with how ancient societies understood time. Important events were rarely isolated. They were surrounded by preparation and followed by continuation. Sacred meaning was not rushed. The Christmas season allowed believers to dwell within the narrative rather than merely acknowledge it. Worship services extended beyond December 25th. Scripture readings explored different aspects of the Nativity story. Hymns and prayers reflected a range of themes: hope, humility, incarnation, and anticipation. The 12 days of Christmas emerged within this context, spanning from December 25th to January 6th. Rather than functioning as a countdown, these days represented a sustained period of sacred time. Each day offered space for contemplation, reinforcing the idea that divine meaning unfolds gradually. This structure also accommodated regional diversity. Different communities emphasized different moments within the season. Some focused on the birth itself. Others highlighted the visit of the Magi. Still others reflected on the broader implications of Christ's arrival. Importantly, the expansion of Christmas into a season did not diminish its seriousness. While later centuries would associate Christmas with festivity, this earlier period remained restrained. Celebration existed, but it was measured and purposeful. Feasting, when it occurred, followed fasting. Joy was understood as emerging from discipline rather than excess. This balance reflected a broader medieval worldview in which order and meaning were deeply intertwined. As Christmas became more embedded in the liturgical calendar, it also became more visible in communal life. Churches were filled more frequently. Public worship drew larger gatherings. The season offered rare moments of collective pause during the long winter months. For many, Christmas became a time of renewal, not only spiritually, but socially. Disputes were set aside. Acts of charity increased. Hospitality was encouraged. These practices reinforced the season's underlying message, that light enters darkness quietly, but persistently. The idea of Christmas as a season also reinforced its connection to time itself. It reminded believers that sacred history did not exist outside the world's rhythms. It moved with the year, shaped by seasons, weather, and human need. This understanding ensured that Christmas remained grounded. It was not an abstract concept, but a lived experience, one that unfolded slowly, inviting reflection rather than demanding attention. By allowing Christmas to expand beyond a single day, the Church created space for depth. Meaning was not condensed. It was cultivated. And in that cultivation, Christmas began to take on the enduring form that would carry it through centuries of change. Christmas in the early Middle Ages. By the early Middle Ages, Christmas had become an established part of the Christian calendar across much of Europe. Yet the way it was experienced differed greatly from what is familiar today. The celebration remained primarily religious, shaped by the realities of medieval life and the structure of the Church. For most people, Christmas was not a moment of abundance. It was a pause within a difficult season. Winter in the medieval world was harsh and uncertain. Food supplies were limited, travel was dangerous, and daily labor slowed significantly. In this context, Christmas offered not escape, but stability. It marked a reliable point in the year, a moment when communities gathered despite hardship. Churches became the center of Christmas observance. Midnight services, later known as Christmas Mass, drew people together in darkness lit only by candles. These gatherings were solemn and communal. Worshippers listened to scripture, sang hymns, and shared in prayer. The atmosphere was not festive in a modern sense. There were no decorations as such, no exchange of gifts, no emphasis on spectacle. Instead, Christmas reinforced order and continuity. It reminded people that time was meaningful, even in its most difficult phases. Monasteries played a significant role in shaping Christmas traditions during this period. Monks preserved liturgical texts, composed hymns, and established patterns of worship that would influence Christian practice for centuries. Their observances were disciplined, structured, and deeply reflective. For rural communities, Christmas was often one of the few times during winter when collective worship brought people together in large numbers. The Church provided warmth, light, and shared experience. In an otherwise isolating season, this gathering mattered. Beyond formal worship, simple customs began to develop. Extra food might be shared if available. Acts of charity were encouraged, particularly toward the poor and vulnerable. These gestures were modest, shaped by scarcity rather than abundance. Importantly, Christmas was not yet associated with childhood or domestic celebration. It belonged to the community, not the household. Its meaning was public, rooted in shared belief rather than private tradition. The Church carefully guided how Christmas was understood. Sermons emphasized humility, obedience, and divine mystery. The Nativity was presented as a lesson in simplicity, a reminder that sacred events do not require power or wealth. This framing resonated deeply within medieval society. Life was hierarchical and often unforgiving. The idea that divine significance could appear in modest circumstances offered comfort and reassurance. Over time, Christmas became woven into the rhythm of medieval life. It did not disrupt the social order. It reinforced it, while offering moments of relief and reflection within it. As the Middle Ages progressed, Christmas would gradually absorb more local customs and expressions. But at this early stage, its identity remained closely tied to worship, restraint, and communal stability. Christmas endured not because it promised joy in abundance, but because it offered meaning in endurance. And in a world shaped by winter's long shadow, that meaning was essential. Christmas beyond the Church, winter life and quiet customs. As Christmas became more firmly established within the Christian calendar, its presence slowly extended beyond church walls. This did not happen through sudden change or formal instruction. It emerged gradually, shaped by daily life, seasonal necessity, and the quiet habits of winter. In medieval communities, the weeks surrounding Christmas were marked by subtle adjustments rather than dramatic celebration. Work continued, but at a slower pace. Agricultural labor was limited by cold and darkness. Artisans reduced production. Travel was avoided when possible. This slowing of life created space. Within households, Christmas became a moment of pause. Families gathered more closely during evenings, sharing meals by firelight. Food remained simple, shaped by availability rather than abundance, yet meals carried greater meaning. Eating together during winter was an act of mutual reliance. Candles appeared more frequently inside homes. Not as decoration, but as necessity. Still, light held symbolic weight. A lit candle during Christmas nights carried associations with protection, presence, and continuity. Evergreen branches began to appear indoors, not universally, and not elaborately. Their meaning remained practical and symbolic. Green life in winter reminded people that nature endured even when growth was hidden. These customs were not organized rituals. They were responses to season and belief combined. Importantly, Christmas did not yet belong to children. It was not centered on gifts or domestic joy. Its meaning remained communal and reflective. Adults understood Christmas as a reminder of humility and restraint, not indulgence. In towns and villages, Christmas brought moments of increased generosity. Almsgiving became more common. The church encouraged care for the poor, especially during winter when vulnerability increased. This charity was not framed as celebration, but as responsibility. Markets did not transform. Streets did not fill with music. Instead, the season carried a quiet seriousness. Christmas was recognized, but not dramatized. What defined this period was continuity rather than spectacle. Christmas did not interrupt winter. It existed within it. This integration mattered. It ensured that Christmas remained credible and grounded. It did not promise escape from hardship. It offered meaning within it. Over generations, these understated practices accumulated. What began as small habits became tradition through repetition. Not because they were enforced, but because they felt appropriate. Christmas adapted to the rhythms of medieval life rather than reshaping them. Its presence was felt most strongly not in public display, but in subtle shifts of behavior, slower movement, shared warmth, deliberate quiet. These early domestic expressions laid the groundwork for later developments. In centuries to come, Christmas would expand into family-centered celebration. But in this period, it remained modest. The season's power came from restraint. In a world defined by winter's limitations, Christmas offered a gentle reminder: life continued, meaning endured, and light, however small, was worth tending. Christmas sounds, hymns, bells, and the birth of seasonal music. As Christmas settled more deeply into medieval life, it began to develop a presence that could be heard as well as seen. Sound, carefully measured and restrained, became one of the most distinctive ways the season expressed itself. In a world without constant noise, sound carried meaning. Church bells, already central to daily rhythm, took on particular importance during Christmas. Their ringing marked sacred time. Not louder than usual, but more intentional. Bells called people together in darkness, guiding them toward shared worship and reminding them that the season had arrived. Within churches and monasteries, music slowly became an integral part of Christmas observance. Early Christmas hymns were not composed for performance or entertainment. They were tools of teaching and devotion. Sung in simple melodies, they allowed congregations to participate collectively in the nativity story. These hymns focused on theology rather than emotion. Lyrics emphasized incarnation, humility, and divine mystery. Musical structure was restrained, designed to support reflection rather than excitement. Monastic communities played a crucial role in preserving and shaping this music. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, ensuring that hymns could be shared across regions. Over time, melodies traveled with pilgrims and clergy, spreading Christmas music gradually through Europe. Outside formal worship, sound remained subdued. Christmas was not yet accompanied by public singing or street performance. Silence remained an important part of the season. Quiet allowed meaning to settle. In rural areas, natural sounds defined Christmas nights. The crackling of firewood. The wind moving through bare trees. The distant toll of a bell carried across frozen fields. These sounds blended seamlessly with the season's message. This soundscape reinforced Christmas as a moment of attention rather than distraction. The limited use of music ensured that it retained significance. When hymns were sung, they mattered. When bells rang, they were noticed. Sound was not constant, it was purposeful. This restraint distinguished early Christmas observance from later traditions. Music did not yet aim to create atmosphere. It served understanding. As literacy remained limited, music helped transmit belief. Hymns allowed people to internalize theology through repetition. The nativity story became familiar not only through words, but through sound. Gradually, these musical practices contributed to Christmas's endurance. They anchored memory. They provided continuity across generations. Importantly, this development did not alter the season's character. Christmas remained quiet, contemplative, and rooted in worship. Music did not transform it into celebration, it deepened its meaning. By the later Middle Ages, Christmas music would begin to expand beyond church walls. But at this stage, it remained closely tied to sacred space and communal devotion. Sound, like light, was carefully tended. And in a winter defined by silence and darkness, even the simplest melody carried profound weight. Christmas in medieval towns, a quiet presence in public life. As Christmas became more established within medieval society, it slowly extended into public space, though never in the loud or dramatic ways that later centuries would introduce. In towns and cities, the season was visible not through spectacle, but through subtle shifts in rhythm and behavior. Medieval towns were dense, active places even in winter. Markets continued to operate. Craftsmen worked when light allowed. Travel did not stop entirely, but it became more cautious. Against this backdrop, Christmas introduced a measured pause rather than a disruption. Churches remained central, but their influence reached outward. Bells marked sacred hours. Processions, when they occurred, were restrained and orderly. There was no emphasis on display. Participation mattered more than observation. Public spaces reflected this quiet observance. Streets were not decorated. Buildings were not transformed. Instead, signs of the season appeared in behavior. Shops closed earlier. Work slowed. People gathered more frequently in small groups, especially during evenings. In town squares, Christmas did not create festivals. It created stillness. For urban communities, this restraint served an important function. Town life depended on order. Excessive celebration risked disorder, especially during winter when resources were limited and tensions could rise. Christmas, as observed in medieval towns, reinforced stability rather than release. Charity became one of the most visible public expressions of the season. Churches and guilds organized almsgiving. Food and basic necessities were distributed to the poor, the elderly, and travelers. These acts were not framed as generosity alone, but as duty. Guilds, associations of craftsmen and merchants, played a notable role during Christmas. They regulated work schedules, encouraged mutual support, and sponsored religious services. Through these institutions, Christmas reinforced social bonds within urban life. Importantly, Christmas remained inclusive. While belief varied in depth, participation in its rhythms extended beyond formal devotion. Even those less engaged with church doctrine recognized the season's significance. This shared recognition allowed Christmas to function as a point of cohesion within diverse populations. It created common expectations, slower pace, quieter evenings, greater attentiveness to community needs. The presence of Christmas in medieval towns was thus understated but effective. It did not demand attention. It shaped behavior through repetition and familiarity. As towns grew larger and more complex, this model proved sustainable. Christmas did not overwhelm public life. It integrated into it. Over time, these patterns would provide a foundation for more expressive traditions. But during this period, the season's strength lay in moderation. Christmas in medieval towns was not meant to impress. It was meant to endure. And in doing so, it quietly shaped the public life of Europe for centuries. Christmas and New Year, two different meanings. As Christmas became more widely observed across Europe, another date stood close beside it on the calendar, January 1st. Over time, the proximity of these two moments would lead to confusion, especially in later centuries. Yet historically, Christmas and the New Year represent two entirely different ideas, shaped by separate traditions, purposes, and meanings. Understanding this distinction is essential. Christmas is a religious observance. It exists within the Christian liturgical calendar and commemorates the birth of Jesus Christ. Its meaning is theological. It reflects the belief in incarnation, the idea that God entered human history in physical form. The date of December 25th, while not drawn from historical records, developed through theological reasoning and symbolic association, as previously explored. The New Year, by contrast, is not religious in origin. Its roots lie in administrative timekeeping rather than belief. In the Roman world, January 1st marked the beginning of the civic year. It was the day when newly elected consuls assumed office, contracts were renewed, and legal authority was transferred. This date structured governance, not worship. The distinction between these two dates, December 25th and January 1st, was clear in antiquity. Christmas belonged to sacred time. The New Year belonged to civic time. This separation mattered deeply in medieval society, where religious life and administrative life followed different rhythms. While the Church shaped the spiritual calendar, political and economic systems operated according to practical necessity. For centuries, New Year's Day passed quietly within Christian communities. It did not carry celebration or ceremony comparable to Christmas. In some regions, it was barely noticed at all. The focus remained on the Christmas season, which extended beyond December 25th through Epiphany. The confusion between Christmas and the New Year is a much later development. As societies modernized and religious authority became less central to daily life, civic time gained prominence. Calendars standardized. Work schedules, commerce, and public holidays began to shape how people experienced the year. In this context, January 1st gained increasing visibility. Fireworks, public gatherings, and expressions of renewal gradually became associated with the new year. These customs were not inherited from ancient Christianity. They developed within secular culture, reflecting human desire to mark beginnings and endings. Christmas, meanwhile, retained its religious core, even as it absorbed cultural expressions. Its meaning remained rooted in remembrance rather than transition. It looked backward to a sacred event rather than forward to an unknown future. This difference is subtle but profound. Christmas asks people to reflect on meaning already revealed. The new year invites people to imagine change yet to come. Historically, Christian leaders were careful to preserve this distinction. Sermons and liturgical texts emphasized that Christmas was not about time passing, but about divine presence entering history. The new year was acknowledged, but not elevated. Even today, this distinction remains visible in Christian calendars. Christmas belongs to a season. The new year marks a numerical change. One is cyclical and sacred. The other is linear and administrative. Modern culture, however, often blends these ideas. The proximity of dates, combined with commercial influence and popular media, has led many people to associate Christmas and New Year's as part of a single festive period. Lights remain up. Music overlaps. Celebrations merge. While this blending is culturally understandable, it obscures historical clarity. Christmas did not originate as a year-ending celebration. It was never meant to symbolize a fresh start in time. Its message was different, that hope had entered the world quietly, within time, without resetting it. Recognizing this distinction allows Christmas to be understood on its own terms. It restores depth to a tradition often simplified by modern habit. The new year belongs to the clock. Christmas belongs to meaning. And throughout history, societies that understood this difference experienced these moments not as a single event, but as two distinct reflections, one sacred, one secular, standing side by side in winter. Christmas and the medieval sense of time. To understand Christmas in its historical context, it is necessary to understand how people in the medieval world experienced time itself. Time, as it was lived then, differed profoundly from how it is perceived today. This difference shaped how Christmas was understood, and why it was never meant to mark the end of a year. Medieval society did not experience time as a continuous forward motion measured in numbers. Clocks existed only in limited form. Calendars were rare. For most people, time was cyclical, shaped by seasons, agricultural rhythms, and religious observance. Life moved in patterns, not deadlines. The Church played a central role in organizing this sense of time. The liturgical calendar structured the year according to sacred events rather than numerical sequence. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, these periods carried meaning beyond dates. They ordered life spiritually rather than administratively. Within this framework, Christmas did not stand at an ending. It stood within a flow. The year did not turn on December 25th. Nor did it end on January 1st in the minds of most medieval people. In fact, different regions recognized different dates as the beginning of the year. Some marked it in March. Others associated it with Easter. January 1st held little emotional or spiritual weight. What mattered was not when the year ended, but where one stood within the sacred cycle. Christmas belonged to a period of waiting and arrival. It emerged from Advent and led toward Epiphany. Its meaning unfolded gradually rather than appearing suddenly. This slow unfolding mirrored the winter season itself, long, restrained, and patient. This perception of time encouraged depth rather than urgency. Events were not rushed. Reflection was expected. Christmas invited contemplation, not resolution. Because of this, medieval Christians did not approach Christmas with the idea of closure or new beginnings. Those concepts belonged to later, more linear understandings of time. Christmas was not about leaving the past behind. It was about recognizing presence within continuity. This difference helps explain why medieval Christmas lacked fireworks, countdowns, or dramatic transitions. Such expressions would have felt misplaced within a culture that did not frame life as a series of resets. Instead, Christmas reinforced stability. It reminded people that meaning persisted regardless of hardship, that sacred presence did not depend on the turning of a calendar page. Over time, as mechanical clocks spread and civic administration became more standardized, this perception began to change. Time slowly became measurable, divisible, and increasingly abstract. But during the centuries when Christmas first took shape, time was felt, not counted. Understanding this medieval sense of time allows Christmas to be seen as it was originally intended, not as a boundary between years, but as a moment within a living cycle, one that returned each winter, carrying the same message of quiet endurance. Christmas did not end a year. It sustained it. How Christmas slowly absorbed local customs. As Christmas continued to exist within the rhythm of medieval life, it did not remain isolated from the cultures around it. Over centuries, it gradually absorbed local customs, not through force or replacement, but through coexistence. This process was slow, uneven, and deeply human. Christianity spread across regions with long-established traditions. People did not abandon familiar winter practices overnight. Instead, they carried them forward, reshaping their meaning within a Christian framework. Christmas became the point where belief and habit quietly met. This absorption did not weaken Christmas. It anchored it. In many regions, winter had always been a time of gathering. Cold weather limited movement, encouraging people to remain close to home. Storytelling, shared meals, and communal warmth were practical necessities long before they became seasonal customs. Christmas gave these habits a new context. The Church did not seek to erase these practices. Instead, it allowed them to exist alongside worship, as long as they did not conflict with belief. This approach ensured continuity rather than rupture. Food traditions began to develop slowly. Special meals appeared where resources allowed. These meals were not extravagant, but they differed slightly from daily fare. The distinction mattered more than abundance. It marked the season without excess. In some regions, evergreen plants, already symbols of endurance, were retained within Christian households. Their presence did not signify worship. It symbolized continuity of life during winter. Over time, these symbols became associated specifically with Christmas, even though their origins were older. Music followed a similar path. Sacred hymns remained central, but local melodies influenced their structure. Familiar sounds made the message more accessible. Participation increased as people recognized elements of their own culture within worship. Importantly, this blending occurred differently across Europe. There was no single Christmas experience. In northern regions, winter customs shaped the season more strongly. In southern regions, emphasis remained closer to liturgical observance. This diversity did not fragment Christmas. It expanded it. Christmas became recognizable across regions while remaining adaptable locally. This balance ensured its endurance. A tradition that allows variation survives longer than one that demands uniformity. Throughout this process, the core meaning of Christmas remained intact. The nativity story was not altered. Its interpretation remained guided by theology. Local customs existed around it, not instead of it. This layered development explains why Christmas feels both ancient and familiar today. It carries echoes of many lives lived through winter, each generation adding its quiet imprint. By absorbing local customs, Christmas did not lose clarity. It gained depth. It became a tradition that could live within real human experience, shaped by climate, culture, and community, without losing its center. And through this gradual adaptation, Christmas moved closer to the form it would carry into the modern world. Christmas in noble houses and castles. While Christmas in villages remained quiet and restrained, the season took on a slightly different form within noble households and castles. These environments did not transform Christmas into spectacle, but they allowed for a broader expression of hospitality, hierarchy, and order, values central to medieval aristocratic life. Castles in winter were enclosed worlds. Thick stone walls kept out the cold but also isolated those within. Winter limited travel, and long evenings encouraged communal gatherings inside great halls. Christmas emerged naturally as a focal point during this period, not as excess, but as structure. In noble households, Christmas emphasized responsibility. Lords were expected to provide for those under their protection. Servants, retainers, and dependents remained within castle walls throughout winter. Christmas meals, though more substantial than those of peasants, symbolized continuity rather than indulgence. Feasting occurred, but it followed ritual order. Meals were shared in great halls where seating reflected rank. Food was served deliberately, reinforcing social structure rather than dissolving it. The act of eating together affirmed stability during a season defined by uncertainty. Religious observance remained central. Chapels within castles hosted Christmas services led by clergy attached to noble households. These services mirrored those held in parish churches, reinforcing unity of belief across social classes. Music played a slightly more prominent role in noble settings. Trained singers or musicians might accompany worship, performing hymns or devotional pieces. Even so, the tone remained controlled. Christmas did not become entertainment. Hospitality extended beyond castle walls. Nobles were expected to offer shelter to travelers, pilgrims, or messengers during the Christmas season. This obligation reflected Christian teaching and reinforced social bonds. Gift-giving existed, but it differed greatly from modern practice. Gifts symbolized loyalty rather than affection. They affirmed relationships between lord and vassal, patron and servant. Objects exchanged were often practical, clothing, tools, or tokens of favor. Children within noble households experienced Christmas as observation rather than focus. The season belonged to the household as a whole, not to individuals. Education and discipline continued uninterrupted. Importantly, Christmas in noble environments reinforced order. It reminded those present of their place within a larger structure, spiritual, social, and political. Stability mattered more than celebration. Despite differences in material conditions, the meaning of Christmas remained consistent across classes. It was a moment of reflection, continuity, and obligation rather than indulgence. These aristocratic expressions of Christmas influenced later traditions. As medieval society evolved, aspects of noble hospitality and ceremony filtered outward. Over time, they would reshape how Christmas was expressed publicly. But in this period, Christmas within castles remained measured and purposeful. It offered warmth within stone walls, order within hierarchy, and meaning within winter's confinement. Hospitality extended beyond castle walls. Nobles were expected to offer shelter to travelers, pilgrims, or messengers during the Christmas season. This obligation reflected Christian teaching and reinforced social bonds. Gift-giving existed, but it differed greatly from modern practice. Gifts symbolized loyalty rather than affection. They affirmed relationships between lord and vassal, patron and servant. Objects exchanged were often practical, clothing, tools, or tokens of favor. Children within noble households experienced Christmas as observation rather than focus. The season belonged to the household as a whole, not to individuals. Education and discipline continued uninterrupted. Importantly, Christmas in noble environments reinforced order. It reminded those present of their place within a larger structure, spiritual, social, and political. Stability mattered more than celebration. Despite differences in material conditions, the meaning of Christmas remained consistent across classes. It was a moment of reflection, continuity, and obligation rather than indulgence. These aristocratic expressions of Christmas influenced later traditions. As medieval society evolved, aspects of noble hospitality and ceremony filtered outward. Over time, they would reshape how Christmas was expressed publicly. But in this period, Christmas within castles remained measured and purposeful. It offered warmth within stone walls, order within hierarchy, and meaning within winter's confinement. That difference mattered deeply to early Christians. At the same time, Christianity was pragmatic. It understood that belief does not exist in a vacuum. By aligning sacred meaning with familiar seasonal markers, the Church allowed conversion without cultural rupture. This was not deception. It was adaptation. Importantly, many early Christians resisted Christmas altogether. Some argued that celebrating birthdays was inappropriate for holy figures. Others feared that associating sacred events with fixed dates risked misunderstanding. These debates demonstrate that Christmas was not universally accepted, nor imposed from above. Over centuries, however, the theological clarity of Christmas prevailed. It was defined carefully, defended rigorously, and separated from pagan worship through doctrine rather than denial. The persistence of the pagan Christmas narrative says more about modern assumptions than medieval reality. It reflects a tendency to simplify historical processes that were, in fact, gradual and contested. Christmas did not emerge as a disguised festival. It emerged as a theological statement shaped within a complex cultural landscape. Understanding this allows Christmas to be seen not as a replacement, but as a reinterpretation, one that transformed meaning rather than borrowing practice. Why December 25th was chosen. The selection of December 25th as the date of Christmas remains one of the most discussed aspects of its history. Contrary to popular belief, this choice was not based on historical records of Jesus' birth. Instead, it emerged from theological reasoning, symbolic interpretation, and the way early Christians understood time and meaning. In the first centuries of Christianity, exact birth dates held little importance. What mattered was significance, not precision. The life of Jesus was remembered through teaching, death, and resurrection, events tied to meaning rather than calendars. The question of when to commemorate the Nativity arose gradually, as Christianity became more structured and reflective. One influential idea within early Christian thought was the concept of sacred symmetry. Some theologians believed that great divine events occurred in perfect alignment. According to this belief, Jesus was conceived on the same date he would later die. This date was identified as March 25th. If conception occurred on March 25th, then birth would follow 9 months later, on December 25th. This reasoning did not claim historical certainty. It expressed theological coherence. Time itself was seen as ordered by divine intention. Important events aligned not by coincidence, but by meaning. This approach explains why December 25th gained acceptance within Christian communities without controversy over historical accuracy. The date served theology, not chronology. At the same time, December 25th existed within a broader cultural environment. The winter solstice marked a turning point in the natural year. Days slowly lengthened. Light returned. For societies deeply connected to seasonal cycles, this transition carried symbolic weight. Christian thinkers recognized this symbolism and reframed it. The return of light was no longer a cosmic phenomenon alone, it became a theological statement. Christ was described as the true light entering the world. This reframing did not celebrate the sun. It redefined light itself. Importantly, this symbolism did not originate from pagan worship practices. It emerged from scriptural language already present in Christian texts. Light and darkness were central metaphors long before December 25th was established. By choosing this date, early Christians expressed belief through alignment with the natural world, without adopting non-Christian ritual. The acceptance of December 25th spread gradually. It was not immediately universal. Some communities retained January 6th as their primary observance. Others adopted both dates, each emphasizing different aspects of Christ's life. Over time, December 25th gained prominence in the Western Church. Its theological clarity, combined with symbolic resonance, ensured its endurance. This process highlights a broader truth about early Christianity: belief shaped practice, not the other way around. Dates were chosen to express meaning, not to mirror existing celebrations. Understanding this helps dispel the idea that Christmas was arbitrarily placed or culturally disguised. It was thoughtfully positioned within a worldview that saw time as meaningful rather than mechanical. December 25th became Christmas not because it was convenient, but because it spoke the language of belief. And in that language, light returning to the world required no further explanation. When Christmas became a public and legal holiday. For several centuries after its emergence, Christmas existed primarily within the spiritual life of Christian communities. It was observed in churches, monasteries, and homes, but it did not yet shape the structure of public life. This began to change as Christianity moved from a persecuted belief to an institution closely connected with political authority. The turning point came when Christianity gained legal recognition within the Roman Empire. As emperors converted to Christianity or supported it openly, religious observances began to influence civic order. Holy days were no longer only moments of worship, they became markers of time acknowledged by law, governance, and administration. Christmas gradually entered this public sphere. By the 4th and 5th centuries, imperial edicts began to recognize Christian feast days. While early legislation focused more strongly on Easter, Christmas slowly followed. Work was reduced. Courts closed. Official duties paused. These changes signaled something significant: sacred time was now protected by secular authority. This development did not happen overnight. Different regions adopted these practices at different speeds. In some cities, Christmas remained largely religious. In others, it became a day when public activity visibly slowed. The recognition of Christmas as a legal holiday reflected more than belief. It demonstrated alignment between church and state. Observing Christmas publicly affirmed Christian identity at a societal level. For ordinary people, this shift mattered deeply. A legally recognized holiday meant rest. It meant permission to pause labor during winter, a rare relief in a demanding world. Christmas became a shared moment not only spiritually, but socially. However, this new status also brought responsibility. Public observance required order. Authorities were cautious. They sought to prevent disorder, excess, or disruption. Christmas was to be respected, not exploited. As a result, early public Christmas observance was tightly controlled. There were no mass festivities. No uncontrolled gatherings. Instead, the day was marked by silence, prayer, and regulated rest. Markets closed. Roads quieted. Administrative buildings stood still. The city itself appeared to slow. This transformation reinforced the seriousness of Christmas. It was no longer optional. It was woven into the rhythm of public life. To ignore it was to step outside both religious and civic expectation. Over time, this recognition strengthened Christmas's permanence. A day protected by law is harder to erase than one sustained by belief alone. Christmas became anchored in calendars, records, and collective memory. This legal acknowledgement also contributed to the spread of Christmas across regions. Where imperial or royal authority extended, so did the observance of Christian feast days. By the early Middle Ages, Christmas had become more than a church event. It was a pause recognized by entire societies. Not because it demanded celebration, but because it commanded respect. And through this quiet authority, Christmas secured its place at the center of winter. Church councils and the authority of Christmas. As Christmas gained recognition in public life, the Church faced a parallel responsibility, to define, protect, and standardize its meaning. This task fell largely to church councils, gatherings of bishops and theologians convened to resolve doctrinal questions and establish unity across the Christian world. These councils did not invent Christmas. They clarified it. In the early centuries of Christianity, diversity of practice was common. Different regions observed different dates. Some emphasized the Nativity, others focused on Epiphany. Without shared guidance, variations risked confusion rather than enrichment. Church councils provided structure. By discussing and affirming the theological meaning of the Nativity, councils helped establish Christmas as a legitimate and essential observance. They addressed questions not of historical accuracy, but of belief. What did the birth of Christ signify, and why did it matter? The answers shaped practice. Christmas was defined as a celebration of incarnation, the belief that God entered the world fully and truly as a human being. This definition was crucial in countering alternative interpretations that diminished Christ's humanity or divinity. By anchoring Christmas in doctrine, the Church ensured that its observance reinforced belief rather than diluted it. Councils also addressed concerns about excess and misunderstanding. Leaders emphasized restraint, reverence, and clarity. Christmas was not to become a spectacle detached from worship. Its purpose was reflection, not distraction. These discussions influenced how Christmas was preached, taught, and observed across regions. Sermons became more consistent. Liturgical texts aligned. Over time, this unity strengthened the observance. Authority mattered. When church leaders spoke collectively, their decisions carried weight beyond local custom. Bishops returned to their communities with guidance that shaped practice at every level, from monasteries to parish churches. This process did not erase local variation. It framed it. Communities could express Christmas differently while remaining within shared belief. The role of councils also highlights an important truth: Christmas endured because it was defended intellectually as well as spiritually. It was not sustained by tradition alone, but by reasoning and consensus. This foundation protected Christmas during times of challenge. When doubts arose, about dates, practices, or meaning, the Church could respond with established teaching rather than improvisation. Over centuries, this doctrinal clarity allowed Christmas to expand without losing coherence. As new customs emerged, they were measured against theological core. The authority established through councils ensured that Christmas remained anchored even as it evolved. By the early Middle Ages, Christmas was no longer fragile. It stood on a framework of belief, law, and shared understanding. It had been examined, debated, and affirmed. And through that process, it became permanent. Who opposed Christmas, and why? Despite its growing recognition and institutional support, Christmas was not universally welcomed. Throughout history, there were individuals and entire communities who questioned, resisted, or openly opposed the celebration of Christmas. Their objections were not born from hostility alone, but from sincere theological and cultural concerns. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, some believers rejected Christmas on principle. They argued that the Bible did not instruct Christians to celebrate the birth of Jesus. For these groups, emphasis belonged elsewhere, on his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. Birthdays, they argued, were associated with earthly rulers, not divine figures. This perspective was rooted in caution rather than rebellion. Others feared that assigning a fixed date to a sacred mystery risked misunderstanding. The Nativity, they believed, should remain a theological truth rather than a calendar event. To bind it to a date was to confine it. As Christmas spread and absorbed local customs, additional concerns emerged. Some critics worried that seasonal traditions, meals, greenery, gatherings, distracted from worship. They feared that practice would overtake meaning. These tensions became more visible during periods of reform and renewal. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, movements arose that sought to strip Christianity of what they perceived as unnecessary additions. For these reformers, Christmas symbolized excess rather than devotion. They objected not only to the celebration itself, but to how it was observed. Feasting, gift-giving, and social gatherings appeared incompatible with spiritual discipline. Christmas, they argued, encouraged behavior contrary to religious seriousness. In some regions, local authorities supported these concerns. They viewed uncontrolled celebration as a threat to public order. Winter already strained resources. Large gatherings risked disorder. Opposition to Christmas, therefore, was not solely theological. It was social and political. Importantly, these objections did not deny the significance of Jesus' birth. They questioned the form of remembrance, not the belief itself. This distinction is often lost in modern interpretation. Over time, opposition to Christmas fluctuated. In periods of stability, celebration expanded. In times of crisis, restraint returned. Christmas reflected broader societal tensions. These debates reveal an essential truth: Christmas was never a passive tradition. It was shaped through dialogue, disagreement, and negotiation. Its endurance lies not in universal acceptance, but in its ability to adapt while retaining core meaning. Those who opposed Christmas played a role in defining it. Their concerns forced clarification. Their resistance encouraged reflection. By responding to criticism, the Church refined how Christmas was understood and observed. Opposition did not weaken Christmas. It sharpened it. And through this process of challenge and response, Christmas continued to evolve, rooted in belief, shaped by history, and defined by human choice. When Christmas was banned. There were moments in history when Christmas was not merely questioned, but actively suppressed. Though it may seem surprising today, there were periods when celebrating Christmas was discouraged, restricted, or even banned outright. These bans did not arise from hostility toward Christianity itself, but from deep disagreements over how faith should be practiced. The most well-known examples occurred during the Protestant Reformation and the centuries that followed. Reformers sought to reshape Christianity by returning to what they believed were its original principles. They emphasized Scripture alone as the foundation of belief and rejected traditions that lacked explicit biblical instruction. Christmas, they argued, fell into this category. To them, Christmas represented excess. It encouraged feasting, leisure, and social behavior they considered spiritually dangerous. The problem was not the nativity itself, but what had grown around it. In their view, Christmas distracted believers from discipline and devotion. As reform movements gained political power, these beliefs translated into law. In parts of England and colonial New England, Christmas celebrations were restricted or prohibited. Shops were required to remain open. Public observance was discouraged. In some cases, celebrating Christmas was treated as an act of defiance. These bans reveal how closely religion and authority were linked. When beliefs changed, laws followed. Yet even under prohibition, Christmas did not disappear. It retreated into private spaces. Families continued to mark the season quietly. Customs persisted behind closed doors. This persistence illustrates the strength of tradition. Even when official recognition vanished, memory remained. Opposition to Christmas was not universal, even within reform movements. Many believers accepted reform without rejecting the season entirely. Debates continued within communities, reflecting broader tensions about authority, interpretation, and practice. Over time, strict bans proved difficult to sustain. They required constant enforcement and often conflicted with popular sentiment. Gradually, restrictions softened. Christmas re-emerged, reshaped by compromise. Importantly, these periods of prohibition influenced how Christmas developed afterward. They encouraged restraint. They emphasized domestic rather than public celebration. They reinforced the idea that Christmas belonged within the household rather than the street. In this way, even suppression left its mark. The banning of Christmas demonstrates that tradition is not inevitable. It survives through choice, not inertia. People decide what to carry forward. Christmas endured because it mattered, not because it was imposed. Understanding these bans challenges the idea of Christmas as universally embraced. It reveals a tradition shaped by conflict as much as consensus. And through these moments of rejection, Christmas was forced to redefine itself, emerging quieter, more personal, and ultimately more resilient. Christmas in art, how the Nativity was remembered. Long before Christmas became a widespread social celebration, it lived most vividly through images. For centuries, art played a central role in shaping how people understood and remembered the Nativity. In a largely illiterate world, images spoke where words could not. Early Christian art did not focus immediately on the birth of Jesus. Initial representations emphasized symbols rather than scenes, light, stars, shepherds, or a child held gently. These images were not decorative. They were instructional. As Christianity became more established, visual storytelling expanded. Churches, monasteries, and manuscripts began to include detailed nativity scenes. These depictions followed no single standard. Instead, they reflected local culture, artistic style, and theological emphasis. In some regions, the nativity appeared humble and sparse. Mary and Joseph were shown simply, surrounded by darkness and silence. In others, the scene became richer, populated by angels, shepherds, and animals. These variations were intentional. Each image conveyed meaning through composition. Art allowed Christmas to become tangible. Manuscripts illuminated by monks preserved the nativity in color and gold. These images were viewed slowly, often during winter evenings by candlelight. They invited contemplation rather than excitement. Importantly, these artistic representations did not aim for historical realism. They aimed for spiritual clarity. Settings often reflected the artist's own time and place rather than first-century Judea. Medieval clothing, architecture, and landscapes appeared naturally. This blending made the nativity familiar. It allowed viewers to see sacred history as present rather than distant. As centuries passed, nativity art became more detailed. Emotions emerged: tenderness, wonder, reverence. The scene remained calm, rarely dramatic. Violence and spectacle were absent. The focus stayed on quiet presence. These images shaped collective memory. For many people, Christmas existed first as an image rather than an event. Art taught them how to imagine the story. The repetition of nativity imagery across generations reinforced continuity. Even when practices changed, the image remained recognizable. A mother, a child, a moment of stillness in winter. This visual tradition also protected Christmas during times of challenge. When celebration was restricted or discouraged, images endured. They preserved meaning without requiring public observance. Over time, nativity art expanded beyond churches. It appeared in homes, on small objects, and eventually in public spaces. Each adaptation reflected changing relationships between belief, culture, and daily life. Yet the essence remained consistent. Christmas in art was never loud. It was intimate. Through paint, parchment, and stone, Christmas found permanence. Art allowed it to travel across borders, centuries, and cultures without losing clarity. The Nativity became one of the most enduring images in history, not because it changed often, but because it spoke quietly and repeatedly. And through these images, Christmas remained visible even in the darkest winters. Dangerous winter journeys and Christmas roads. In the medieval world, travel during winter was rarely undertaken by choice. Roads were unreliable, weather unpredictable, and daylight scarce. Yet even in these conditions, people moved, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of devotion. Christmas, arriving in the heart of winter, intersected with these journeys in quiet but meaningful ways. Pilgrims traveled to churches believed to hold relics or special indulgences during the Christmas season. Messengers carried letters between courts. Traders attempted limited movement before deep winter closed the roads entirely. Clergy moved between parishes to lead services. Each journey carried risk. Snow concealed paths. Rivers froze unevenly. Forests grew silent and disorienting. Travelers relied on landmarks, memory, and local guidance. Inns were few, and shelter uncertain. The decision to travel near Christmas was often weighed carefully against survival. For those who did travel, Christmas offered moments of refuge. Monasteries and churches opened their doors to the weary. Hospitality was not guaranteed, but it was encouraged by Christian teaching. To shelter a traveler during Christmas was considered an act of mercy. These encounters shaped how Christmas was experienced beyond fixed places. The season became associated not only with home and church, but with movement and vulnerability. Stories circulated of travelers arriving just before nightfall, guided by bell sounds or candlelight from distant buildings. Christmas nights, long and cold, heightened the importance of shared shelter. In towns along major routes, Christmas slowed traffic. Gates closed earlier. Guards limited passage. Roads grew quieter. This stillness marked the season as a threshold, a pause within the movement of the year. Travel during Christmas also carried symbolic weight. The nativity story itself involved movement, a journey, a search for shelter, arrival under difficult circumstances. Medieval listeners recognized these parallels instinctively. Sermons and readings reinforced this connection. The experience of travel, uncertainty, reliance, endurance, mirrored the spiritual themes of Christmas. Despite danger, journeys continued. Life did not stop for winter. Christmas did not suspend necessity. It existed alongside it. These realities grounded the season. Christmas was not an escape from hardship. It acknowledged it. Over time, the association between Christmas and travel shaped tradition. Later centuries would romanticize winter journeys. But in the medieval period, the emphasis remained practical and sober. Travelers remembered Christmas not for celebration, but for moments of kindness encountered along the road. A warm fire. A shared meal. A place to rest. These experiences reinforced Christmas as a season of care rather than abundance. By connecting Christmas to movement and risk, medieval society understood it as part of real life, not an idealized pause, but a companion through difficulty. Even on frozen roads, the season traveled with those who carried it, quietly, deliberately, and without promise of ease. When Christmas slowly became joyful. For much of its early history, Christmas was marked by restraint rather than celebration. It emphasized humility, reflection, and endurance. Yet over time, a subtle transformation began to take place. Without abandoning its sacred core, Christmas slowly acquired a gentler warmth, one that allowed space for joy. This change did not arrive suddenly. It emerged across generations, shaped by social stability, improved living conditions, and the gradual softening of winter hardship for some communities. As food supplies became more reliable and trade networks expanded, winter no longer carried the same level of constant threat for everyone. Within this shifting reality, Christmas adapted. Communities began to allow modest expressions of happiness alongside worship. Shared meals became slightly more elaborate. Music grew more frequent. Laughter appeared, not as indulgence, but as relief. The church did not resist this transformation entirely. Instead, it guided it. Leaders emphasized that joy was not incompatible with reverence, as long as it remained grounded in gratitude and moderation. This balance mattered. In towns and villages, Christmas evenings increasingly included storytelling, simple games, and song. These activities were not performed publicly or competitively. They took place within homes or small communal spaces, framed by winter darkness and firelight. Children began to play a more visible role. While they were not yet the focus of Christmas, their presence shaped the atmosphere. The season softened in response to them. Seasonal foods gained symbolic meaning. Special bread, shared wine, preserved fruits, small variations that distinguished Christmas from ordinary days. These foods did not signal abundance. They signaled care. Music also evolved. While sacred hymns remained central, melodies became more approachable. Familiar tunes allowed wider participation. Christmas soundscapes grew warmer. This shift toward joy did not erase discipline. Fasting periods still preceded Christmas. Worship remained central. Celebration followed preparation. Importantly, joy was understood as communal rather than individual. Christmas happiness belonged to the group, not the self. It reinforced bonds rather than drawing attention inward. Over time, this gentle joy became expected. Christmas was no longer only a moment of reflection, it became a moment of shared relief within winter. This transformation reflects a broader pattern in cultural history. Traditions that endure often find ways to incorporate human need without losing meaning. Christmas succeeded because it allowed space for emotion while preserving belief. By the late Middle Ages, Christmas carried two identities simultaneously: sacred observance and human comfort. These identities did not compete. They complemented each other. The season's warmth grew not from spectacle, but from familiarity. Christmas became joyful not because it forgot hardship, but because it acknowledged survival. And in that acknowledgement, it offered something rare: permission to smile in winter. Christmas moves toward the modern world. By the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, Christmas had reached a turning point. The foundations of the tradition were firmly in place. Its theological meaning was defined, its position in the calendar secured, and its presence woven into both religious and social life. From this point forward, Christmas would not disappear. It would transform. As societies changed, so did the way Christmas was experienced. Urbanization altered daily rhythms. Trade expanded. Communication improved. Printed text spread ideas more rapidly than ever before. These shifts did not replace Christmas, they reshaped how it was understood and shared. Christmas gradually moved from exclusively sacred space into broader cultural life. Public observance increased. Music became more accessible. Written carols circulated beyond monasteries. The season became more visible, especially in cities where populations were larger and traditions could spread quickly. At the same time, domestic life changed. Households grew more central to social identity. Christmas followed. What had once belonged primarily to church and community slowly entered the home as a focal point. This transition did not remove religious meaning. It redistributed it. Christmas became a moment where belief, memory, and family life intersected. Rituals remained, but they became quieter and more personal. The season adapted to new realities without abandoning its core. And in that acknowledgement, it offered something rare: permission to smile in winter. Importantly, this shift laid the groundwork for later traditions often assumed to be ancient. The emphasis on warmth, togetherness, and reflection grew from centuries of lived experience rather than sudden invention. Christmas did not become joyful because society became shallow. It became joyful because society found room to breathe. Even as disagreements persisted, about excess, belief, or practice, Christmas endured. It survived reform, resistance, and reinterpretation because it addressed something constant, the human response to darkness and time. By the time the modern world began to take shape, Christmas was already resilient. It had been tested by hardship and preserved through adaptation. It no longer depended solely on authority or doctrine. It lived in habit, memory, and shared expectation. Christmas had become both historical and personal. And in that balance, it found permanence. The enduring meaning of Christmas. Across centuries of change, one truth has remained constant: Christmas has never belonged to a single moment in history. It has endured because it was never fixed in form, only in meaning. From its earliest theological reflections to its place in modern life, Christmas has carried the same quiet message. It speaks of presence rather than power, of light without spectacle, of meaning that does not demand attention. This endurance did not come easily. Christmas survived debate, resistance, and suppression. It was questioned by believers, challenged by reformers, and reshaped by societies in transition. At times, it retreated into silence. At others, it emerged with renewed expression. Each time, it returned changed, but intact. What allowed Christmas to persist was not tradition alone, but balance. It remained open enough to adapt, yet grounded enough to remain recognizable. It accepted culture without surrendering belief. It welcomed joy without forgetting restraint. This balance explains why Christmas continues to resonate across different societies and beliefs. Even when stripped of doctrine, its structure remains familiar: a pause in winter, a gathering of people, a moment of reflection. Christmas does not promise escape from darkness. It acknowledges it. Historically, this acknowledgement mattered. Winter was real. Hardship was constant. Christmas did not deny these realities, it existed within them. And that is why it endured. The story of Christmas is not a story of invention. It is a story of continuity. It reminds us that traditions survive not because they are imposed, but because they are carried. Generation after generation chose to remember. Chose to pause. Chose to keep the season alive. In doing so, they shaped Christmas into something larger than a date or a celebration. They shaped it into a shared memory, one that could move through time without losing meaning. As the world continues to change, Christmas remains familiar not because it resists transformation, but because it understands it. It waits, quietly, each winter. And when it returns, it asks nothing more than attention.